Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope you guys can hear me. If not, please let me know on the chat or verbally. So yeah, so last time, so it's been, last time we were discussing more about the projects with individual groups. So before that, we were looking at unsupervised learning, and within that, we spent a bit of time on variational autoencoders, and we could not discuss much about generative adversarial networks. So what I'm going to do is cover that part, GANs, in a section where we're going to talk about images again. So we're going to revisit some techniques with that work with images, some techniques that work with text in in about 3 lectures from now. So I'm going to cover GANs there. Okay. So today and the next couple of weeks, I'm going to focus more on a slightly different paradigm of machine learning called online learning, and it encompasses things like multi-armed bandits, contextual bandits, as well as reinforcement learning. Okay, so it's going to be a shift in the underlying problem. So far we've been essentially looking at supervised learning problems. But for the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to look at problems which look like supervised learning problems, but they are actually slightly more involved than that. And the convergence point will be in the third lecture. We're again going to revisit deep learning. Okay, so deep learning as a component in this online learning framework. Okay, and so we'll look at deep reinforcement learning to be specific. So that's the agenda. So we're going to step back and look at a slightly different problem than supervised learning and unsupervised learning that we've been seeing. We saw in the previous six lectures. And by the third lecture from today, which is 2 weeks from now, we'll converge onto, again, neural networks as a core component in the techniques that we'll see in this set of 3 lectures, which is related to online learning. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, of where we are going now, it's just that we had a nice set of collection of deep learning techniques for images, text, and images and text predominantly in the first 6 lectures. We're going to step back and think a little bit more about slightly different problems and then converge back to images and text. Okay. So what are the goals for today then? So as I said, today's lecture is the first in a 3-part sequence. So today's lecture, as the title says, is about online learning. It's about A/B testing. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on A/B testing, and then I'm going to introduce a couple of, I guess, newer techniques or classes of techniques. One is called multi-armed bandits, and the other one is called contextual bandits. Okay, and these are going to lead us to a more general framework in the second part in the series, which is called reinforcement learning. Okay. So we'll just look at elements of reinforcement learning, the basics, in the next lecture. And in the third lecture, the third part of this 3-part series, we'll look at how to use reinforcement learning with neural networks to really, do really well in more complex problems. Okay, so the goal for today is to understand, at the end of the lecture, hopefully you will understand what is online learning and how is it different from supervised learning. What's the relation between general predictions and decision making? Okay, so sometimes these are the same thing. You predict whether to give loan to a person or not. It's the same as you deciding whether to give a loan to a person or not. Okay, but many times it's not the same. Okay, if a prediction is not exactly the same as decisions. Okay, that you or the firm or the product has to take. And then one of the goals today is to introduce multi-armed bandits. Okay, so you should try to understand what the underlying specific problem is. And we'll look at a few solutions, but you just need to understand what's the trade-off being made in multi-armed bandits. And then the last goal for today's lecture is to understand what is called as a contextual bandit setting. Okay, so contextual bandit setting is a little bit of an improvement or a little bit more general than the multi-armed bandit problem, and we'll see what it entails and what exactly is this bandit. Okay, this word bandit mean and so on. Okay, so those are the 4 goals for today's lecture. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with some motivation, essentially in the first few minutes. So what we're trying to do is to tie back to our predictions and say, okay, we're making predictions, but that may not exactly be our decisions. Okay, so the first few minutes today, as well as the whole next three lectures, we're trying to think beyond predictions. We are really thinking in terms of decisions, some actions that the firm takes. For example, if you go to Spotify, and if you're a Spotify customer, Spotify is taking some actions, maybe pricing actions, or what songs to show on, what songs that they want you to discover, and things like that. So you can think of them as potentially predictions, but you can also think of them as decisions. Okay, and if you think of them as decisions, they're much more richer objects. Okay, um, but we'll disambiguate this a little bit more in the next few slides. So in the first lecture in this series, in this course, we discussed very briefly about complex prediction problems. Okay, and we said, I'm going to repeat those examples here. And those complex prediction problems had, of course, could be solved using deep learning, and but the essential feature of them was that could be solved using deep learning, but there were also complex decision problems. Okay, and we briefly talked about it in the first lecture, but we'll look at it in a little more detail. So what's the difference between complex predictions, which is what we've been doing in the first 6 lectures, basically, looking at, let's say, some of you, we've looked at language translation, we've looked at word embeddings, we've looked at sequence models in general, but CNNs as well, and so on. These are all somewhat complex prediction problems because the data itself is not very simple tabular input. Okay, but we also briefly discussed complex decisions, and the idea in those problems is one of the ideas in these types of problems is that you get feedback on what you decide. Okay, and we'll really extrapolate. We'll really spend a lot of time on what exactly is feedback in the setting. Okay. So as I said, we'll look at the first part, which is what is online machine learning and some basics today. Next lecture, we'll look at RL, and the next lecture after that, we'll look at deep RL. So let's now revisit the complex prediction or complex decision problems that we briefly mentioned in the first lecture. Let's talk about it again now. The first example of a complex decision problem, or complex decision making problem, is that of inventory management. Okay, so this is a very classical problem, pretty much in every industry, every business. As long as they're selling something, services or products, basically you need to manage your inventory. Okay, so for example, you could have current inventory levels, and you could have a prediction workflow where you are predicting what's going to be the future demand for my units in my inventory. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's not the prediction itself, but you will need to decide how many units of maybe each item to purchase today, okay, to replenish your inventory, because you're seeing some demand for your inventory, and so they will be consumed. Okay, but the number of units that you decide doesn't just depend on your predictions, but it will also depend on how much budget you have, like the money you have to purchase these items. Maybe there is stocking requirements, like you don't have a place to put the new things that you're going to buy, so the additional information can also determine your actions. So therefore your predictions are not exactly the same as your actions, and here you may be concerned about the business objective, for example, the profit. Okay, so but predictions could be an integral part of you taking actions that maximize your rewards. The second example is that of, in general, a resource allocation problem. So for example, you have a call center and you have a queue of customers calling in, and some of them are, you only have a few call center agents. Then how do you do you have to prioritize certain customers? Maybe certain accounts are worth more for your business than others, and so there's a decision being made in terms of who to provide, for example, the customer service first. Okay. The last example of a complex decision-making setting is that of routing. Okay, so this has become a very um, ubiquitous thanks to services like Google Maps and Apple Maps and so on, or OpenStreetMaps. But routing problems are present not just in consumer-facing things like these apps that I mentioned, but also in the trucking industry or shipping industry and so on. So basically, you want to figure out which trucks, for example, need to be assigned to which cargo, and when should they leave their sources, when should they arrive at the destinations, when should they take a stop, what routes to take, and so on. So there's a lot of decisions being made, but underneath them, there are, of course, predictions being made in terms of, oh, if I leave today, there's some estimated arrival at the destination, given traffic intensity and speeds and so on, right? So there's some predictions, but that's not the end goal. You need to complement that with something more. So under this complex decisions umbrella, for us, since we're looking at machine learning techniques, one tool of interest is called reinforcement learning. Okay? So the learning part just corresponds to learning a good a policy that tells me what actions to take. Okay, so learning is all about what to do. Okay, and the first part, reinforcement, just means that we can learn by trial and error. Okay, but in a more intelligent way. So not trying out every actions that we can take and figuring out what happens next. So that's the idea behind this tool, and some folks have said that this is a promising direction in data science because of various considerations. In reality, you will see that many problems map to actually some sort of a reinforcement learning type of a situation than a vanilla supervised learning setting. Okay, so this is a screenshot from I think from MIT Technology Review, which is showing RL as a breakthrough technology, and this is 2017. I think in 2018 and 19 also, I think it was present, or some variation of it was present in the list. Okay. So the next slide is just showing a few examples of how reinforcement learning has just started to rise again. And so the idea behind this technique of of doing machine learning with complex decisions has been there for more than for several decades now. But the idea has had a resurgence because we're now able to work with much more complex decision-making settings. And so one example is this screenshot, which is showing the screens of several games in the Atari Atari game suite. So these are 2D games from the 80s. So folks, so some researchers, some research groups were able to train agents, as in basically computers, to figure out what best actions to take by looking at the screen, so as to maximize the reward. In this case, the reward is profits. The points at the end of the day, at the end of the game, right? So they were able to train. They were able to train agents which could learn what best actions to do in this complex environment. The complex environment being, like a video game here, and they learn using reinforcement, as in using trial and error. Okay. So this was a big jump, and along similar lines, folks from DeepMind were able to compete with a professional Go player back in 2016, and I think back in 2016, and they were able to beat the #1 Go player at that time in terms of world ranking. And here again, it seems like it's just that the game here is quite complex. So it's it's a deterministic game in the sense of there's no randomness or anything, but it's like chess essentially. But still, it was unclear how to use computers to figure out the next best move to make. Okay, just like in chess or any other board game, you need to figure out what's the next step. It's an action that you need to determine, and it has long-term consequences. But computers were not yet at the level of a top human player at that point. So folks were able to use some ideas from supervised learning as well as reinforcement learning to come up with a agent, again a piece of software, to make really good moves and therefore compete with the human player and actually win. Okay. So with that background in terms of, trying to clarify that there is something that needs to be augmented to predictions, while and needs additional considerations, and that's what I was trying to cover by talking about complex decisions and some examples of that. In that backdrop, we're going to look at some basic ideas first. So first is the idea of online machine learning in general. So it's just a way of thinking about what is the problem setup. And so there's a keyword online. So we'll talk about what is online, and there's going to be a notion of feedback. And so we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at three techniques. A/B testing is actually something that some of you might have seen before. We'll recap that, and then and these techniques have a sequence. In the sense, A/B testing you can think of as being able to achieve something, and then multi-arm bandits is going to improve on A/B testing in some aspects, and then contextual bandits are going to improve on multi-arm bandits in some context, in certain aspects. Okay, so you can think of these as three sets of techniques that we're going to look at in a linear order. So let's talk about online machine learning, but is there any question before we jump into some of the basics here?
Yeah. Can we quickly draw like Venn diagram or something like where reinforcement learning falls? So if we start with like AI, then is it parallel to machine learning or parallel to supervised learning inside machine learning?
So the overlap, so, okay, there's something called batch reinforcement learning, okay, which is very similar to supervised learning. So actually there are different problems, right? So supervised learning and then unsupervised learning. Okay, so these are different problems, right? So first of all, there are no targets here, and you just do clustering, or last time we talked about sampling. So we were talking about VAEs and so on, and GANs. So RL has an intersection in the sense that certain problem in RL called batch RL is similar to supervised learning. But RL, and then, so, okay, in terms of Venn diagram, I would say, let's call this MAB, and let's call this CB. Then MAB is a subset of CB, is a subset of RL, and RL includes deep RL. Okay, a deep RL just means there are some subcomponents which use deep learning.
Okay.
Okay, but RL also has, I guess, has something to do with supervised learning. Okay, so they're not exactly. I wouldn't. Okay, maybe this is not the right picture here. So supervised learning is not a subset of RL itself. There is some overlap, but that's in a slightly different flavor of a problem called batch RL.
Okay.
Maybe it will become clearer. I'm going to try to do this again, maybe at some point in the future, so that it's
Okay.
more clear.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
But these three, the things that we and A/B testing, you can think of. It's not nested in here, but it's a technique. It's a technique. You can say it's like inside. So it's the technique inside, and then it's covered by bandits, multi-arm bandits, covered by contextual bandits, covered by RL.
Okay. Sounds good. Yep.
For today, but the intersection with supervised learning, we're going to talk about it, maybe revisit it again.
Okay, thank you.
But as I said, the key distinguishing point is going to be the focus on decisions. So when we say learning here, whatever we are trying to learn. So in supervised learning, we're trying to find a function which maps from input to output, because we have supervised data, supervision data. So we know for what inputs, what should the output, at least in the training data. And so we're trying to find a function which pretty much predicts the same thing in the training data, and hopefully it generalizes well to unseen observations, unseen new inputs. It predicts it produces a good number or class or whatever it is, right? Here, learning is not really about. Learning is about finding a function as well, but the function helps us make decisions. Okay, so there's going to be these objects which are a little bit more general than class labels. Okay, instead of like if you predict, for example, when will the class labels be the same as actions? For example, if you're predicting whether to give somebody a loan or not, then the prediction is essentially the same as taking an action. If your prediction is low, that you should not give this person a loan because they're going to default, then your action is going to be, oh, don't give a loan. Okay, so in this case, there's no distinction between decisions and predictions, but in general there could be distinction, right? And so, for example, if you think of the inventory management problem, your actions, how much to stock, you can make a prediction of how much to stock itself, but then it also has to depend on other things, right? For example, how much, if you want to, how much to stock depends on how many units you're going to purchase, and how many units you're going to purchase depends on extra information than just your prediction of demand. Okay, it depends on how much budget you have, and for example, inventory space that you have. So there's a gap between decisions and predictions, and so these set of methods are trying to capture more, are going to be mostly in terms of decisions rather than predictions themselves. Okay, anyway, so when we talk about learning, all I'm saying is learning is about learning functions which tell me what to do, rather than learning functions which predict or forecast, tomorrow's rain or tomorrow's demand or whatever it is. Okay. And so we're going to be very specific about what decisions. These are going to be actionable items that a firm can take, or anyway, like for example, if you're thinking of finance, how much stock to buy today, or how much to sell tomorrow, and so on. Exactly. Not just tomorrow's price or something, or tomorrow's return. Anyway, let's come back to online machine learning. So what is it? Just so let's focus on the word online. So the idea is as follows. So this is a template, okay? Of a template is different from supervised learning. If you think of supervised learning template, you have inputs, you have outputs, you want a function which maps from input to outputs, okay? And you have training data to figure out what this function is, right? So in online machine learning, the setup is as follows. You are optionally, not always, but sometimes you're given the state of the world, okay, or some feature vector. Just think of it as a feature vector or a context. It's measurement that you can get optionally. You choose an action, and this is what I meant by you make a decision, okay? And then you get a feedback, and you get a feedback on what you did. Okay, so maybe today you got an observation from the world in terms of how the markets are, the stock market is, and based on that you took an action. You bought certain stock and sold some certain stock, and tomorrow you get to see how bad your position was. I mean, because what you bought might have increased in value, or what you bought might have lost value. Okay, so get feedback for what exactly you did. Okay, so and then this process gets repeated. So there's this observe something, take an action, get a feedback, and just think of that in a forward loop. In a for loop, and that's essentially what online machine learning is about. Okay, so of course now this is a very generic description. You have to now map your actual business problem to see, oh, is this does it map to this online learning template that I just described, right? For example, the stock market, if you're making a trading bot, then maybe it corresponds to this setting, right? Because you make observations, you take actions, and you get feedback on what actions you took. Okay, and this, what's hidden in the word choose is that when you're figuring out what actions to choose, you may have to do some statistics, some learning there. Okay, so learning is embedded in this for loop, except that you're doing this again and again and again, because you're getting incremental new information about how you're performing again and again. Okay, so what is the goal? The goal is to generally optimize feedback. So you want to get good feedback. So for example, if your feedback is how much profit you made, incremental profit you made in a day, maybe you care about ensuring that the incremental profits are always positive, or always the highest, or something like that. So you want to optimize. I'm just calling it as optimizing feedback here. So maximizing, for example, the reward for what actions you did. Okay, and for now, I'm gonna just point this out, and we're gonna drop this assumption towards the end of this lecture, and that's where the full reinforcement learning setting comes out. Is we're gonna first, as for now, for the majority of this lecture, 99% of this lecture, we're gonna assume that today's actions have no influence on future context, and it makes sense. If, for example, think of it this way, right? So if you are a day trader, but your capital is small, then you purchasing a certain stock or not is not going to influence the pretty much not going to not going to influence how the stocks evolve tomorrow. Okay, of course, if you move large positions in the stock market, then it's going to get influenced. So that's what it means by the future state of the, for example, stock market is not really influenced by you buying and selling, for example. Right? It makes sense for the stock market example. But for those who did not get that, stock market aspect, all I'm saying is that, for example, let's say you are Spotify. Today, I show you a particular list of recommended songs, and maybe you like them, so that's my reward. You spend more time on my app, on this app. That's my reward. But what I show today hopefully has no bearing on the next session. Maybe tomorrow again you open Spotify, and what I showed today hopefully has no bearing on you being you forming an opinion about Spotify's recommendation system, for example. But it could be an invalid assumption to make. But for now, for today's discussion, we'll think of those business settings where the action that I take today has no longer term influence on the future context of feature vectors that I get. Okay. So this is very different from supervised learning, right? So there's no, like, whether you make bad predictions or not, we're just going to assume the data is coming from some fixed IID, some fixed distribution, which we don't know about. Okay. Okay, so let's now, so I was talking about stock and so on, but let's actually concretize with an example, because this is something that was actually launched a few years ago, or the online learning aspect was launched with this particular web property a few years ago. This is about MSN.com. So it's a very prototypical, web property, like just like a news, New York Times or something like that. It's basically, it has a collection of articles positioned in various locations, maybe some ads and so on. And what the objective is to personalize the news. Okay, so basically try to show things where which are personalized to the user's context, or what their for example previous browsing histories and so on, so that they spend maybe more time on the website, or click on more valuable articles in some sense, or ads, whatever it is. Okay, so that's the business problem. And now we're going to talk about how it maps to the online learning template, and therefore how you can think of it in that lens in terms of a solution. Okay. Okay. So how does it map to the online learning template? Here's a for loop. User arrives at this web property with their information. Typically, it's stored in the cookies, IP address, or whatever, and maybe they have a login. They have a Microsoft account, which they are always logged in the browser, whatever it is. They have an account, previous visits, and so on. So this is the context that comes to Microsoft. The person who's learning here is Microsoft, or the firm here. So some context came. The Microsoft, or who was handling this website, chooses chooses the things to show to the user, and not just things to show, but where to show, how to position them, what order. There's a lot more. There's a lot of decisions to make here, right, on the screen of what goes where, and so on, right? So Microsoft does some actions, and then user responds, right, with some, how they respond to the content that's being displayed. For example, clicks, they navigate from A to B, or they spend a lot more time on the page, or whatever it is. So that's the response. Okay, and this keeps happening. And the goal for the firm here is to choose, make appropriate actions to yield a certain desired user behavior. Okay, maybe it's clicks that you care about, then we want maybe higher clicks to happen. Okay. And assumptions are recommendations to one user do not affect other users. For example, I log in and I saw, and Microsoft chose something, and I responded by saying, "Oh, nothing is good." I close the tab. Okay, and in the next second, there's another user who visits the same website from somewhere else, maybe from Canada. That person's Microsoft showing me some bad recommendations has no influence on that person's interest in visiting this website, right? So it's kind of unrelated. Okay, so recommendations to one user do not affect how other users respond. Okay, but if it was the same person, maybe the first few recommendations are quite, or the way the content is organized or personalized to me is bad, then I may have a you can imagine that I may have now a bias towards, okay, the content is generally bad on this website. So the next time I respond to this web page may be different. Okay, so that is goes against this assumption. But let's for now let's assume that there's no consequence of you showing, let's say, some bad recommendations for the next time a different user or the same user sees the page. Okay, but this is the online learning loop. And so given that loop, what would a solution at a block level look like? Is the follows. Okay, so first, you as the firm or who can control what to show and where to show, right? So you first collect, you parse and get some information like the user demographics. You get some history information of what type of articles they click on, maybe sports, or maybe they're more interested in music or whatever it is. And then you have articles that you are intending to show today, but there are a lot of articles. So you also get feature vectors for them as well. And somehow, and use that information, that's your context, full context, right? This context. Get that information, you somehow produce, for example, this is a concrete object, a rank list. Okay, it's a ranking of these 50 articles in terms of what's the most important thing that needs to be shown at the top, and maybe what's the next important thing that we think makes sense for this user, and so on. Okay. And so that list is sent to the front-end server, and then that's the thing that's actually shown on the page. And then the user, maybe clicks on one of these things, or maybe closes the tab or whatever, and then whatever they do is logged as feedback. Okay, and so this part happens on the browser side, and all this happens on the server side. Right. So that's how at the block level, it looks like, and this block here, the online machine learning part, it's very similar to a supervised learning block, right? So it's basically taking some input and is producing a, in this case, a ranked output, okay, a ranking over a fixed set of things, right? In that sense, you can think of it's a function, so it's taking some feature as input, feature vector as input, and producing a certain output, and the output space is a little bit rich, right? Here it's a rank list rather than a single class label or something like that, or a word or something. But so that's but model of that is just a function. Okay. So before we get into opening the black box, slowly over the next, today and next lecture, let's look at what happened, based on a specific box that they created, that the online machine learning module. So Amazon itself has a lot of users. This is actually from 4 years ago. So now I think it's probably more. So they have lots of users, lots of requests per second. And when they added this extra, this function, automated function, they had some overhead compared to what they were doing before. Okay, so before I think they may have a different solution. So they had some overhead in terms of this guy computing the good things to show to the users. Okay, they use a lot of servers for training, as in figuring out that function. Right, training is very similar to supervised learning, figuring out what's a good function over there, and they were updating the model every 5 minutes. Okay, in their decision making module essentially. And this is what they saw. This is about so their objective, I think, in this case was just click rates, and so they saw over 25% improvement in click rates. So this is a function of date versus the relative improvement. So it's like 25% over what's the click rate. So click rates themselves are pretty low, right? Like 1% or something, or less than that, and you have like a small improvement over that. Okay, so relative improvement is pretty good, 25%, but it's a multiplier on the actual baseline click rates. Okay, so that was an example of a success story, but I think there are a lot more examples that you can find today. But let me just quickly give you some very related ideas. So for example, you can do the same with content recommendation, just like news article recommendation on apps, websites like Netflix and so on, Hulu. And you can also personalize search results. So many of these problems, it seems like it should essentially be a supervised learning problem, but recall that the decision spaces can be very different from what you predict. Okay? Like customer churn prevention, You can predict whether the person churns or not, but based on the information, what actions you take, and eventually see whether the person churned or not, and incorporate that information, and again improve your decision making, whatever it is. Maybe to prevent churn, you may want to send them emails, marketing emails or something. So the decision spaces are a little bit different than just base predictions. So so that's the general idea. Is it and one more idea or a sub idea, and we're going to revisit this, is that this black box that I showed earlier for MSN, or any solution here, it will generally have a source of randomization within it. Okay. And it'll become more clearer later. So think of, for example, in supervised learning, you just create a model. Let's say it's a gradient boosted decision tree. Maybe use light GPM or maybe XGBoost or something. You have a function. Okay, it takes an input and produces predicted output. Here, it's a similar thing. You have a function, but the function needs to have some internal randomness for certain reasons, and those reasons we're going to talk about 5 minutes from now. Okay, so that's, I guess, one point of difference from supervised learning to this. Okay. In addition to the output spaces being richer. Any questions at this point?
So the recommendations here are is also like a vector rather than just saying a particular article. So is it like you're training for a particular cluster of articles, or how does that part work?
The training is to learn this function, right? So this function is mapping from context to, in the MSN case, it's just a rank list of
Okay.
articles. Okay. Like article IDs, for example. Article 3 should be number 1, article 4 should be number 2, and so on.
Okay.
Or,
Okay.
But the way this function is trained is a little bit, it could be same. It would pretty much be the same as a supervised learning problem, except that we have to think a little bit more about what is called, I would say, bandit feedback. Okay. And we're going to disambiguate what this means. So there's going to be a slight difference. Okay, so the training would be very similar to supervised learning training. So you would typically have an input-output, pair of a data set, and you could actually, this F could be a gradient boosted decision tree, but it's just that there has to be some fixes that we need to make because of a certain type of setup that we have. Okay, it's this online learning setup. And just to give a teaser, what is bandit feedback is that you only get information on the you only get a performance, or you only get a score of what the user did on exactly what you showed. Okay, you don't know if I showed something else, what would have happened. Okay. That's a common problem in reality, right?
Right.
So we're gonna explain that a little bit more as we go forward, but just a teaser right now.
Okay.
There's gonna be a slight difference in that. Okay, that's gonna cause a difference in terms of how we train this function, get this function.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so we cleared this. At least we motivated watch the online machine learning template, and we saw a couple of examples. Now let's actually talk about something which is a little bit more familiar to us. It's not really machine learning. It's mostly just collecting data and doing a hypothesis test at the end of the day. But that will give us a sense of the problems here. Okay, so let's start with A/B testing. So who has not heard of A/B testing? Can somebody, who has not heard of A/B testing? Then they can maybe type it on the chat. Okay, so some folks have not heard of A/B testing. So it's good. So I think different people may have different levels of information or idea about A/B testing. So let's revisit that idea. Okay, so A/B testing is about figuring out whether A is better or B is better in a data-driven way. So what is A and B? There are two choices, two options. Okay. For example, if I want to say is the recommendation system that I currently have in Spotify versus a new system that the ML team developed, which system is better? We don't know. So you can actually find out which system is better by actually doing a what is called a randomized control trial. Okay, so A/B testing is the same as a randomized control trial. It's just a different name. And it's also called split testing for some of you who might have heard of split testing. So it's all the same. Okay, so it's all about doing a randomized control trial. Mostly we're going to talk about online settings, because online as in like internet settings. But let's revisit that. So what is the typical business scenario? You have you decide on improving a product or service, then you and some competing ideas may emerge, right? And there could already be an incumbent idea that is already solving a problem. Now you want to make a decision whether whether you want to improve on something, right? So, and you have competing ideas, so, or competing solutions. How do you pick one of these solutions? Okay. One way to do it, it's not the only way, but one way to do it, which is a little bit more data driven, is to do what is called A/B testing. And it's a setup, at the end of, it's a setup basically, which includes at the end of the day doing essentially a certain type of hypothesis test. It is called a 2-sample hypothesis test, and determining whether first, one of the ideas is good or not. Okay, determining whether which of the ideas is good, or it lets you make a decision on picking one of the ideas. Okay, so it's I guess a decision aid in some sense. So there are companies, many companies. Optimizely is one of them. Monetate. Actually, even Google Optimize that's literally the brand name. So there are many companies here. It's actually extensively used. So as data scientists or as ML folks, if you go work for, let's say, the search engine Bing.com, they actually do thousands of A/B tests every week. So not just Microsoft, but many of the tech companies do lots of A/B testing, especially because they are user facing, and so they need to figure out from the users, what works and what doesn't work. And that's a good way to figure out their product decisions. Okay, extensively used in many marketing tools. Of course, extensively used in other areas like clinical trials, and that's actually the canonical original area which spur a lot of research or development of techniques which are behind A/B tests, okay, or randomized control trials. I don't know if this number is even correct. It may be much bigger. So here's an example. Okay, so you can look at page A and page B. So very simple example. They want to figure out how to convert more users. Okay, so maybe they should they have some coupons, and the question is, if they show a coupon entry, I guess field here, does that influence the conversion rate or not? So maybe people are browse to the website. At the end of the day, they are actually trying to make a purchase, but they come to the purchase, checking out, and they come to paying the money, and they see, oh, here's a sorry, there's a shipping method, but above that, here's a coupon field. Okay, if they did some marketing and from somewhere this person got a coupon, they can enter it there and finish the checkout. The question is, which one leads to a higher conversion rate? Okay, any answers?
B.
Okay, so the answer is, let's say B. Okay, it's not very critical. Let's say answer is B. So what is this actual solution? Okay, actually B is not the good solution actually. So site lost 90% of the revenue. Okay, apparently is because a lot of users want to find the coupons before and they stop at the checkout page, so they don't really actually check out. Okay, so adding this additional thing in their case somehow did not lead to higher conversion. Okay, so but it's not a golden truth that you have to have. So you should not have this at every checkout page. It may or may not be valid for a different site or a different audience and so on. Okay, but in this case they had two ideas, but they didn't know which one would lead to a higher conversion. And they figured it out that B is not a good thing to do for their setting. Okay, how did they figure it out? By doing an A/B test. And how do you do A/B test? Okay, so let's ignore the online learning ideas that we just discussed. Just a few minutes ago. For now, let's focus on this particular problem. Okay, and we're going to relate it back to online learning pretty soon. So let's ignore instantaneous feedback in the sense that if I show let's say website B, I know who checked out. So we have an instantaneous feedback that maybe somebody checked out, maybe somebody did not check out. But we're not going to really use that information immediately, in the sense that we'll get feedback, right? Feedback is essentially whether somebody converted and therefore I got some money or not at the end of the day. But we're going to ignore that information for some time, okay? Because we were essentially going to do an hypothesis test after some after aggregating, after collecting collecting information for each option that we have. So what is the setup? The setup is to show both option A, in this case the option A, and option B several times to several users, okay, in a certain way. And we're going to talk about that randomized split, which is very simple in the next slide. Show the option A for some number of users, maybe 50 users. Show option B to another 50 users, and then you have 50 now. 50 after figure out of 50 users how many converted, and out of 50 users who saw B, how many converted, and you got you aggregate that feedback. And then based on this aggregated numbers, you can make a decision. Okay, and the decision is the outcome of a hypothesis test, like reject or not reject the null. Okay. So as I just saying, you just show both the solutions and figure out if solution A is different from B, as in like is worse or better than B. And how you do that? How do you show these two solutions? You just do randomization. Which is that as users arrive to your platform or to your website, you split them 50%. In this case, since there are only two choices, you split them into two groups. Okay, arbitrarily, you flip a coin, basically unbiased coin. Flip a coin and show the user with probability 0.5 the existing solution. Let's say website A. And with the 50% probability, you show them the new website, okay? Maybe with feature X, in this case, the coupon coupon field, okay? And then you collect information about what they did. I mean, for us in the running example, the objective was whether they actually checked out the process and paid the money, right? And then the last part is to analyze the experiment. So you have this 50 users, not 50 users, but let's say we only had 100 users, then roughly 50 users saw A, roughly 50 users saw B. And based on what they eventually did, we can figure out whether which option is better or not. And that's kind of pretty kind of straightforward, right? So let's see. So we collected the outcomes and figured out which option was better. And before we even talk about what are the specifics of figuring out which option is better, this intuitively it makes sense. What makes sense? Intuitively, the random split makes sense. Okay, because recall if I show A to 50 users randomly and B to 50 users randomly, I am ensuring that there is no user specific characteristic that I'm relying on to show A or B to the user. Okay, in some sense, if there was a some user context which was relevant for them, some other user context which is relevant for them to let's say make the purchase on let's say B versus A, then that gets washed out because I randomly put this people in, randomly show the people option A or option B. Okay, so this randomization is important to kind of wash out the effect of anything else influencing the outcomes. The only thing that can influence the outcome is the difference between the two options. Okay, the actual difference between the two options, the control versus the treatment. There is no other external information that can actually influence the user's choice. Can influence the outcome. In this case, let's say whatever the conversion or checkout or whatever. Okay, so that's the key idea here at the intuition level. Now we can talk about tests in the next. So basically the idea is randomization helps us focus on ensuring that only the control influences the outcome and only the treatment influences the outcome. And if those are the only two influences, then we can talk about, since only control influences outcome and the outcome is better, therefore control is better. Okay. But how do we do that? How do we actually compare? So those specifics are determined by typically a hypothesis test. Okay, and generally this is a two-sample hypothesis test because there are two samples, one under the control, one under the variation or treatment. Okay. As I said, randomization is key requirement. Now let's talk about the specifics of how you would decide. Okay, how do you decide A or B? Randomization has already been done. We collected the data, and so let's say so we're going to start making some assumptions about the situation, and then we have data, but we can also make assumptions about the situation. For example, that each group of users has a true mean effect of mu1 and mu2. True mean effect could be the conversion rate, for example, right? That there's a 50% chance of them converting once they reach the checkout page for the first group, and maybe there's also a 50% chance of them converting if they reach the checkout page under the treatment, which is the second website. Okay, let's say mu1, mu2 could be like 50% each. Okay, 0.5, 0.5, for example. Now that's our assumption. That's our hypothesis. Okay, typically the hypothesis, before you do an A/B test, is that it doesn't matter whether that the new thing that you're trying to deploy, launch, or whatever, try out, the B, which is the treatment, there is no difference between the treatment and the control. That's one typical hypothesis that typically you start with. Okay, and now with a statistical test is trying to figure out whether, under the assumption that there is no difference between A and B, how likely is the observations, the outcomes that we observe. Okay, so under the assumption that there's no difference between A and B, what's the probability that I'm seeing the numbers that I'm seeing? Okay, so because I got some numbers from users visiting the website A or option A or trying out option A, and there's a bunch of numbers that I got, or conversions or whatever I got from users going to option B. Under the null hypothesis, I'm assuming that they are the same, but under the assumption, how likely are the numbers I've seen? Okay, that's literally a probability value, and that value being high or low determines whether I can reject the null or not reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so there are several words, but here, I mean, several terminology. One is significance. Okay, this is basically related to what is called type 1 error. There's also a, okay, let me not. Yeah, so let me first talk about the hypothesis itself. So null hypothesis is generally represented as H naught. You can say that maybe mu1 is equal to mu2. Okay, that's the null hypothesis. And under this null hypothesis, you want to find the probability of observing something, and observing whatever we observed actually. So observing data given mu1 is equal to mu2. Okay, or given h naught is true. Okay, now if this number is really small, okay, if the number is really small, you can get a sense that, oh, and if h naught was true, observing this type of data, the data that I actually observed is a really small number, but I did observe it, which means that maybe h naught is not true. Okay, so therefore I can reject the null. Okay, but if the probability of observing certain data under the null is large, is high, then yeah, so whatever observed is has a high enough probability under the assumption that there is no variation, there's no difference between, let's say, A and B. This is usual, so there's no need to reject the null that A and B are similar, so I don't have to pick B explicitly, right? So B is not a good thing for B. Okay, so is the idea just this is actually called the p-value, and typically you compare it with let's say if this value is less than 0.05, or actually much more stringent numbers if you're in health sciences area. Okay, so generally you want this, not that you want, I mean, you want to check that this p-value is really small, then you can actually reject the hypothesis, reject the null hypothesis. Okay. Okay, so there's a question whether this is a t-test. Yes, actually, so there are many tests that you can do which have two sample variations of them. So there's a t-test for when you have a single sample of data. Here we have data from version A or version B, or control and treatment, or it could be more also. Okay, there could be three choices. There are three different things. So for two sample t-test is what I'm roughly describing here. But although what I described is not very specific to the t-test itself, there are other tests also which work with two samples. Okay. So there are different types of hypothesis tests that you can use. A two-sample t-test is one example of a test that you can do here, depending on your question. Okay. So if you're looking at clicks, right? So if you're aggregating clicks, the mean clicks, for example, then they're essentially count. There are counts, right? So 10 clicks versus 5 clicks versus, then you need to have a different underlying assumption on the distribution. Okay, because count data typically you can use some sort of a slightly different distribution, like a Poisson distribution. So then the underlying test will be slightly different. T-test makes sense when you think makes sense when you're looking at averages across the two choices, because averages have assuming what is called central limit theorem, they those random variables behave like normal distribution, so that's good. Okay. So anyway, so there's some details about the underlying test, but if you want, you can think of this, what I'm describing, as a two-sample t-test if you want, but that's not the only test here. Okay, so just as so that's it. That's the idea of A/B test. So you need to first do an experiment where you are able to reliably do randomization. So your randomization should not depend on the user context itself. As long as you can do that, collect the data. That's phase one. And phase two is pick the appropriate test based on your assumptions about the type of data you're trying to compare with, right? And whether, for example, normality assumptions make sense. And for example, in two-sample t-test, a typical assumption is that the variance for the two, two distributions is the same. So if the variance is basically standard deviation of the two distributions is the same, if it's not, then you'll have to, if it's not true, then you have a slightly different test, for example. So that's phase two. So in the phase two, you just decide one of the hypotheses, and there are many. Now you may say, oh, do I have to remember all these tests? You don't. There are different ways, and there's different popular ones that you just have to, look up what assumptions are being made. But there's also certain views, like for example, you can think of all these hypothesis tests as some sort of tests on the coefficients of a linear regression model. So you can, there's different ways to kind of make good sense of these hypothesis tests. If just to summarize that there. Okay. Just to point out a few types of tests. Fisher tests are those where you reject the null. The typical, these are, I guess, Fisher tests. Neyman Pearson type of tests, they look at likelihood ratio. So probability of data under the null hypothesis divided by the probability of data under the alternative. And if for example, if this ratio is large, then you prefer the null. If this ratio is small, then you can prefer the alternative, right? So there are some variations in terms of the types of tests also. Okay, and finally, there's the Bayesian test where you're computing the posterior distribution of under each assumption that you're making. So for example, you have the data. So you had at the beginning of time, you didn't know whether A is better than B or B is better than A. So those are essentially two different choices, which is essentially like H0 and H1. Now you've gotten data. Now you can compute a posterior distribution on whether A is better than B or B is better than A. That's essentially what like a Bayesian way of doing it is, and it's the same as, I guess, basically Neyman Pearson if your prior is the same. Okay, if your prior is the same, then you can just see by Bayes' rule or by just using the conditional probability law that you can get rid of the priors, and so you'll get a ratio which is exactly the same as this. Okay. But anyway, that's some details about the test. So let's come back to our block, one step higher, and just think of what is the, A/B testing can let us decide which action is good. So in our case, the actions are going to be these two, right? Whether to action or a decision that we need to take is whether to show keep website A or choose a new variation, which is website B, let's say. Okay. So A/B test is essentially a tool. It's a data-driven tool for us to decide one of these actions. Okay. There's no explicit model here. There is a data being collected based on which is getting summarized into a test statistic, and that's using the test statistic you can get a p-value, and based on the p-value you can decide which whether you're going to decide A or B, for example. So the pros for A/B testing are it's an intuitive setup, right? Just do randomization, and as long as you choose an appropriate test, you can actually make a decent decision. But at the same time, there um, and one of the key advantages is that you're actually doing a field experiment, right? Actually a randomized controlled trial, and instead of making decisions just based on the data you've already collected. So there's a difference between actually testing in reality, your new option versus using just existing data to figure out how the new option would fare, because the existing data would be from the existing solution, right? So if all your data would be from, let's say your existing solution is website A, then that data will not really may not help you figure out how would website B perform, right? So field experiment is going to help with that. Okay, and it's very highly used in industry. It's in different industries, and particularly the tech industry, especially in ML and ML related products and services. And actually, they're more used in the industry compared to the techniques that we'll see later, Bandit techniques, because they are really intuitive and communicate things to business stakeholders using simple numbers, just like p-value, for example, right? And these A/B tests need not be one-time process. You can keep repeating the A/B test again and again and again. For example, especially in online or internet-based services, like for example, if you're doing A/B testing on search engine results, then you should repeat the test again and again, because the user behavior may change over time, and so what you thought was a better option may actually become a worse option later. Okay, so these are some. Yeah.
You mentioned the offline data analysis to be more error prone, or the A/B testing to be more error prone. I mean,
not error prone. So with offline data, you may not even be able to figure out what's the worth of the second option, right? For example, the second website. So think of the offline data, which is all the conversions that happen with version A. But you have no data with version B, which is what you want to deploy, right?
Okay.
How are you going to get a sense of how good is version B in the website case, like adding that coupon field? Okay. You don't know. Right. How do you get that information, right? Okay. In this case, you need to do an A/B test.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
So it's not about error-prone online versus offline. So making decisions from observational data. So offline data is typically the technical word people use is called observational data. So using observational data to make decisions requires some assumptions. Okay, sometimes it's not even possible to make decisions using observational data. Okay, and times that you can make assumptions, you can make decisions. You have to make some assumptions.
Okay.
Whereas a field experiment or an A/B test, literally you are trying it out on your users anyway. So you get a data-driven number, right? So you have tried both options. You know which option is better than the other.
Right. Got it. Okay.
Okay. The cons. So good thing about A/B testing is actually it's pretty intuitive. 2 phases: just randomize and next pick a right hypothesis test and make a decision. But at the same time, there are many bells and whistles to make it work, in the sense that, especially when the what is called the treatment effects. So let's say you know that version B is going to improve something. Okay, maybe version A was no machine learning, and version B was some ML-based more ML-based recommendation engine. Let's say, okay. So you know that version B is going to give you some better engagement or something like that. Okay, so let's pick Spotify as an example. But you don't know how much is the delta, how much is the improvement in user engagement. Okay, what happens is, for some effects are huge. Okay, maybe going from no machine learning to full, like a machine learning backed solution, maybe you will see a huge 20% improvement in any metric like conversion or users engaging in your website or something. Okay, but after let's say you did this, and therefore you figured out let's use machine learning model, and later on you're figuring out smaller and smaller improvements. Okay, and the smaller those because next improvements are not going to be large, right? So at some time you've already figured out best options, and later on if you want to do another test for another improvement, a new feature that you're adding, that may not have much a priori you may expect that the effect is not going to be that huge. Okay, so if that's called treatment effect, that we're hoping that the treatment or the option B has some effect on some reward or outcome that we're expecting. If the treatment effect is small, then I guess the short answer is that you'll need to run the experiment for a long time, okay, to detect such a small treatment effect. And that just goes back to how what's the power that you need for the test and so on. Some details about the testing mechanism, okay, the testing framework. So what I'm saying is most treatment effects. So after the big wins with some early choices, okay, maybe you're doing many A/B tests. The initial A/B tests may already give you a good may have huge effects, and therefore you can run the tests in like 3 days or 4 days, and therefore figure out whether option A or option B is better. But later on A/B tests, the effects may be small, so you have to run the test for a longer time and things like that. So there's going to be those complications. Okay, but there are many other issues with A/B testing because there's the underlying eventual decision making tool is a hypothesis test. The hypotheses, they come with their own, sometimes come with their own assumptions. Especially the parametric versions, like t-test is a two-sample t-test is a parametric test. You can have non-parametric tests, which two-sample non-parametric tests, which remove away some assumptions. But at the same time, there are other issues. For example, I don't think I've listed it here. For example, you may indulge in what is called peaking, for example, which means that you stop the test when you think, let's say you originally planned to show it to 500 users for option A and 500 users for option B, but within like 30 users, you already saw that there's a higher conversion rate for B, and so you stop the experiment early. Okay, so that's called peaking, and that's a very bad thing to do. So so there's those many issues like that. Okay, not just peaking, there's also multiple hypothesis testing. And so on. So there are some issues with doing the test correctly. Okay. The second issue, which is what I guess motivates rest of the lecture, is we want to be efficient with our allocation, right? So for example, we know, let's say we have the option A and option B, and maybe within 10 rounds, we get a sense that option B is quite terrible. Okay, not just similar to A, but it's like really bad. Then is there a mechanism by which we can redirect a little bit more folks to option A, because we don't want to have all these, because we don't want all these users who are getting allocated to option B to have bad experience. Okay, but we still want to test option B. So there's some trade-off that we can induce, and we can do that if we can do something dynamically. Okay, and that can be done using the multi-arm bandit framework. Okay, so there's some gains to be had by improving upon the A/B testing idea. Okay, and we'll look at it next. And further, if you want to optimize over several options, let's say even 2 options or whatever, 10 options, but dynamically, okay, we can think of something like multi-arm bandit, and I'm going to discuss that soon. But you also care about user context. So maybe different users in different contexts. Maybe when users open the Spotify app in the morning versus users who open Spotify app in the in the evenings or in the weekends, maybe the context influences how I can get user engagement better in each of these contexts. So that can be, in A/B testing, you can't explicitly capture that, right? You can say per context do A versus B, but there are so many contexts, contexts of the feature vectors that you can have that you can't really realistically do A/B testing at that level. So you can look at, so we'll look at contextual bandit as a fix for that, as a potential option for that. Okay. So anyway, so I'm going to examine what is multi-arm bandits and contextual bandits in the next few slides. Any questions at this point about A/B tests? There's just so we talked about online learning as a template where there's a feedback loop at essentially every interaction with the user. When in my narrative, I'm talking about users and you doing some actions like recommendations or pricing or whatever. But it's the same idea holds for many other settings. Okay, so as I said, clinical trials is one example where you can actually use multi-unbound techniques were initially designed as a solution for clinical trials. So there, it's not really users are basically patients, and you deciding to give them a placebo versus a drug is your decision space. Okay, but let's move forward. So now I'm going to talk about bandits. Okay. So, and now bandits are going to resemble back to our online machine learning template because we're going to do something dynamic. Okay, we're going to dynamically figure out who's going to see what. Okay, and therefore we're dynamically going to take actions. Remember, and now our actions are going to be A or B, or generally any actions, any set of actions. Okay. The A/B testing, you can think of the A and B as two actions, but we're not really doing anything with the actions because we're randomly picking users to go to go to one website or the other is as good as saying I'm randomly picking an action to show to the user. Okay, so randomly picking one of the A or B actions to show to the user. So that's the connection to online machine learning. So in A/B testing, we are not really taking into account the feedback after every action that we take, if we randomly take an action, because we are collecting the data and eventually taking making a sense out of it using a hypothesis. In multi-unbounded settings, we get the feedback, we take an action. It could be random, it could be whatever. And we get a response. Maybe they checked out or not, and based on that, it's going to influence how we pick our next action. Okay, so it's dynamically updating who sees treatment, who sees control. Okay, so let's start with the basics. So multi-unbounded problem, I'm going to introduce the problem, and you will see that it's a specialization of the online ML for loop template that I was talking about a few minutes ago. So so it's going to be in the same for loop, but it's going to involve the following in each interaction. Okay, so there's going to be arms or actions. It's just terminology. Okay, arms or actions that I can play in each round. Okay, so for loop is index, right? For I is equal to 1 to n. So each I or each for t is equal to 1 to n. So each t is a time index. Okay, is some sort of a time index. And so you can think of that each time or each index is an interaction. Okay, is that interaction, is that body of that for loop. Okay, in each interaction, I'm going to do something with the arms or the actions that I have. I can show website A or website B, for example, right? So I'll make a choice, and website A, website B, or for example, A and B could be like just the ads, two different ads on two different websites, or the colors, for example, or whatever. And I'll show them, and the user is going to do something. For example, they may click. Maybe they decide activities to click on something, or maybe they decide activities for them to spend a lot of time on that article. Let's say it's an article page or something like that. So I'll take an action and I'll immediately get a reward, which is gonna be a click or a purchase or something like that. Okay, so that's the specialization. What's missing here is context. Okay. So I'm going to, as I said, in the template, there was the optionality, right? So the context was optional. So in this multi-unbounded setting, think of the same for loop, but in each round, there's essentially a user who comes, but I don't know anything of the user. But I have a bunch of actions, let's say 3 actions here, shown by these machines. I'm going to talk about the machines in a second. I have 3 actions, let's say, and I show one of the actions. Because I don't have a context, I show one of the actions. Anyway, so it's not, there's no mapping from context to actions, but I still have 3 actions to show. I can show one of the actions, maybe randomly, or in some, using some idea, some strategy. I show some action and I get a reward that the user clicks on something or not. Okay, and then this for loop keeps repeating. The next round, some other user comes again. I take one of the actions, show website A or B or C, and again the user does something again and again. So this keeps going onwards. Now this making a choice is where I'll try to decide what to show based on what happened in the past rounds or past rounds of interaction. Okay. Now, why these pictures? These are actually, if you guys can see, is just they are just slot machines. These are, I guess, each one is called a one-armed bandit. Is just a, I guess, colloquial usage of the word there. And so by the way, bandit is like a thief, right? Anyway, so these are one-armed slot machines. Sorry, these are just slot machines, and maybe the success probability of you winning, let's say jackpot or something, are different for each of these slot machines. then you, by pulling the slot machine several times, you can get a sense of which one has a higher win percentage, for example. You have to pull it up probably a long time, each one. But pulling an arm is like, playing a slot machine's handle. Okay, that's why it's got, there's an arm and there's a bandit here. Okay, let's look at the formal setting. The formulation is we have k arms or k actions or k websites to show, for example, variations to show. And each corresponds to an unknown distribution of rewards. Okay, there's unknown distributions. I'm going to just use new k as a symbol there. And let's say these distributions have a support which is between 0 and 1. Okay, so these are just like some sort of a distribution or something like this. Maybe if it's a discrete distribution, it's something like this. Some probability mass function, okay, between 0 and 1. At each time t, the agent, as in our algorithm, picks an arm or picks a decision, which website to show, for example, from these k choices, and we observe a reward. Okay, maybe the user clicks on it or maybe doesn't click on it. Okay, and that reward we're going to assume is going to come from the distribution corresponding to the arm that we picked. So if you picked website 1, the click rate is going to depend on clearly makes sense that it depends on the website 1's characteristics. Maybe website 1 doesn't even have a good ad, so maybe the click rate is going to be low. Okay, and we're going to assume that these are IID samples. Okay, these rewards are IID random variables from this distribution. Okay, and our objective is to maximize the expected sum of rewards. So I'm going to assume that this xt is the reward at time index t. So at time index t, I showed version 1 of the website and I got some reward. Maybe they clicked or maybe they did not click. Okay, so maybe, for example, that's a binary outcome, binary random variable, and my objective is to maximize the sum of rewards. For example, maximize the sum of clicks. Okay, throughout through a certain period of time, maybe the next month. Okay. So let's also introduce a couple of other notations. There's a mean reward for each arm, which is mu k, which is just the expectation with respect to the distribution of the random variable, and mu star, for example, which is just the maximum of all these mean rewards. Okay, so if x was just click or no click, then you would have a distribution which is just to support 2 on 0 and 1. Maybe some probability they click, with some probability they don't click. They sum to 1. Okay, so as I just described in the previous slide, it is an online problem, right? There's a for loop where in each round I try something, I pick an action or a decision, and I also get an immediate reward. Okay, and so there are a few strategies that you can immediately think of how to play the arms or make decisions. One example is a round robin strategy. Round robin strategy, right? Where you in the first round you pick for arm 1, second round you pick arm 2, third round you pick arm 3, and the fourth round you again pick arm 1, for example, if the number of arms k is 3, or number of 3 actions or number of variations is 3. Okay, that's one example. That's a very deterministic strategy. And there's also another strategy which is just pick some arm and just keep playing that, or just keep doing the same thing. For example, I somehow zeroed in on website version C, and I keep showing website version C to everybody. So whatever be the strategy, there's a way to measure the performance using several notions, and one of the notions that is popular here is called cumulative expected regret. Okay, I guess expected cumulative regret. It is a number, okay, and that number is going to be let's say expected cumulative regret over n rounds. Okay, n rounds of interaction, or n periods. Okay, n interactions, little n. So that number is n times mu star, right? If I knew what the best arm was, so maybe there's one of these websites in if I know everything about this problem, unknown parameters, for example, then I know one of the arms, one of the websites, for example, is the best website. I keep showing that in every round. Okay, there's some expected reward that I can get by showing the best thing in every round. That's n times what's the mean reward of the best decision that I can make, right? N times mu star. And Okay, I don't think I have added an expectation there. So let's drop the expected part. Minus over every round, t is equal to 1 to n. What is the reward that I actually got? Okay, so that's a random variable, right? So xt is a random variable, but I can take an expectation over here. I can take an expectation of this, and that's the expected reward. Okay, so when I say expected, I'm talking about this expectation here. Okay, so yeah, so this is a performance measure, okay, that we care about, and our objective is to find a strategy, find maybe a round robin strategy or a constant strategy. They are, it's obvious that, for example, a constant strategy is probably not going to be good. A strategy with small expected cumulative regret. So this expectation of Rn is what we care about. We want to keep it as small as possible. And it's called regret because if you know everything about the problem, then you'll always pick the best website, right? But we don't know what the best website is. This is the performance of the best. If you always pick the best website, for example, but we don't know, so we have to learn something, right? What is which website is the best? We need to learn, and so as we are learning, we hopefully we're making better and better decisions. And so the gap between what we did, the rewards that we collected because of what we did versus the best reward that you could have gotten if you knew everything, if you knew the answer of which arm or which action was the best, that gap is called cumulative regret. Okay, and you want to keep that gap. Ideally, you want to figure out your strategy of playing arms or making decisions or showing the websites, and hopefully learning over time so that this gap is as small as possible. Okay. Any questions at this point? So we're going to look at a very good strategy now. So hopefully that will make things more clearer. The strategy is called epsilon greedy strategy. Okay, so you can actually go offline. After this class, for example, think about what type of strategies may make sense. So here's the strategy. The strategy is like a strategy which is a mixture of a scientist and a businessman. Okay, in the sense that what it's going to do is at any given point of t, you need to at any given interaction t. Let's say you have already interacted with users 100 times, and then at the 101st interaction, what are you going to do? Okay, the idea is you pick the subjectively best arm with some probability at that point. Let's say 101st time instance, and with some probability you pick a random decision. So you pick a random website to show. Okay, so what is the subjectively best arm? So let's say you've finished 100 rounds. Okay, finished let's say 99 rounds, and let's say k was 3, for example, 3 websites. Then maybe by after finishing 99 rounds, maybe you showed the first website 33 times, second website 33 times, and third website 33 times. Let's say you happen to do that. Okay. Now for the 100th interaction, what will you do? Because I showed the first website 33 times, you can get a sense of out of the 33 times, you also got feedback, right? Like maybe clicked or not. So you can get an average click rate performance for the website 1. Similarly, for website 2, you can get an average performance of how the click rate was. Similarly for website 3. So you can compare these 3 numbers. You have a sense of which website is good among the, because of the 99 data points that you collected. So you can, based on that, you can determine, let's say website C is better. Okay. So that website C, you're going to show website C to the next guy, the 100th, interaction with probability 1 minus epsilon. Okay. Where epsilon is, let's say, let's say 15, okay, some number, so 15%. So 1 minus epsilon, so 1 minus 15% which is like 0.85. Okay, so with 85% probability, you're going to pick the thing that you think was the best based on historical data you collected. And but with some probability, which is epsilon by k, okay, k is 3, let's say, because we have 3 websites. So 15 by k, with 5% probability, you'll pick a random website out of these 3. So you'll pick website A with probability 5%, website B with probability 5%, website C with probability 5%. Okay, so this is a strategy, and this strategy is basically letting you be like a scientist and a businessman in the sense that you are, the scientist part is basically you are picking random things, so you're being risky and doing something. Businessman is basically relying on past information to pick the best so far. Okay, so basically, in some sense, exploit the best solution so far, and scientists basically explore new ideas or try out something random. Okay, so so what is the intuition of this strategy? Okay, and how does this relate to having a regret, expected cumulative regret small? Okay, the idea is that basically to do well, we need to explore the arms. Explore just means, at the beginning of time, for example, you have these three websites, you have no sense of which one is better or not. So you need to try them out. Okay. Which is like a scientist, right? So you need to try the websites out, figure out a sense of what is the click rate for each one of them, for example. But you also need to exploit the information you've learned so far. Otherwise, you'll not be able to compete with the best website. So because n times mu star is the performance of the best website in hindsight, right? So at some point you need to also be greedy. So hopefully you're trying out the thing that was actually best. That will hopefully be the best one. Okay. So that is captured by this idea of exploiting the best idea, and you're just randomizing between those two. Okay, with some probability you're trying out arms to get a sense of better feel for what the mean rewards are or mean click rates are, and with some probability you're trying out the arm that is currently the best, hoping that currently the best one is hopefully the final best one, and therefore you will have less regret because of that. Okay? This is the one which is caring about regret. This is the one which is caring about getting a sense of all these arms so that you can minimize regret eventually. Okay. So that's the strategy, and here's a plot. Here's a plot of interactions or time. Is like 250 interactions, and the y-axis is saying what's the probability of you uh, uh, picking the best arm. Okay, you picking the best arm. Okay, so and there are several curves here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each curve is basically for different values of epsilon. Okay, so epsilon in that epsilon greedy strategy has that epsilon, right? With how much probability you'll try out a random thing. Okay, so if epsilon is 0.5, okay, then you're basically closer to a scientist. So let's say we have 5 arms. Okay, instead of the 3 websites example, we have 5 arms, and there are these are the true mean rewards of those 5 arms. So mu1, mu2, mu3, mu4, and mu5. So we know that mu star is equal to mu5. Okay. So this plot is trying to show how many times how many times are you gonna, with what frequency are you gonna pull the 5th arm. Okay. And you can see that with different levels of epsilon in the epsilon greedy strategy, you are slowly and slowly getting closer to pulling the 5th arm with higher and higher probability. So you can see that at the beginning, pulling the 5th arm is low, like 25%. Maybe at some point it becomes 50%. At some point it becomes all the way to it's probably 90% here. Okay. So it just shows what's the probability of you picking the best arm. Okay. And the higher the probability, and you'll see that it'll never reach 100% because epsilon is the lowest number of epsilon is 0.1. So with 10% probability, you'll always try out something random. Okay. It's 90, yeah, or 92%, let's say. So this is just a plot of how you're going to perform if you spend more time on exploration. More time on exploration versus more time on exploitation. It doesn't mean that exploiting is better than exploration, because if the time period is only I think in this plot, if the time period is only up to the first 50 rounds, then you can see that the red curve is maybe somewhere over here, and the what is it called, the purple color is better than that in terms of probability of picking the best arm. Okay, so all I'm saying is that epsilon is a parameter, and depending on the choice of epsilon, you may do better or worse depending on the horizon length. Okay, so any questions about this part? So you need to think about this epsilon greedy strategy as a way to dynamically change what you show to users. For example, round robin strategy, it doesn't depend on the data. It doesn't depend on what outcome was happening with every time I showed the, let's say, variation 1 versus variation 2 versus variation 3. Similarly, constant strategy, I'm showing the same thing whether I get good click rates or not. Now, epsilon greedy strategy is the one where I'm deciding to, based on the outcomes that I'm getting the feedback for, to pick the current subjectively best arm that can change over time, right? Because like if I get more and more data, one of the arms can get better and one of the arms can get worse because I'm picking out the current best arm and playing that with some probability. But I'm also trying out, if it just happens that some other arm is better, then I can get a sense of it by trying out that other arm with some constant probability. Yeah. So actually, that MSN example, I think they were just doing epsilon greedy, but of course there was context involved. So, but if you ignore context, then basically they were doing epsilon greedy in that example. Okay. So actually, let's take a break for 10 minutes and resume at 5:13. Okay. Any questions about the epsilon greedy algorithm? If not, I want to spend a little bit more time on why this is called. So what is the type of feedback that we're getting? And the type of feedback we're getting is called bandit feedback. And that's kind of differentiates this from, I guess, supervised learning. But although there's no context in this current part, so the bandit feedback aspect refers to the idea that if you take action, IT at time index t, then you only get to see the reward for that action. So R of IT. Okay, I don't know if it's called R, but R of IT. You don't know what would be the reward if I took action, 1 or all the way to R of K. So you don't know these numbers. You don't observe them. Okay, that's called bandit feedback. If you had what's called full information feedback, then although you took action IT and you got a reward for that, you kind of observe these anyway. You would also know what would have happened if you had chosen some other action. Okay, like for example, in the website case, you would also know what would have happened if you had shown a different website. But that's unrealistic, right? But this makes sense if you're thinking of a supervised learning problem. Okay, in supervised learning, let's say let's say user uploads an image, and I just need to give them a label saying whether it's a cat or a dog or a fox. And let's say I give a label. Okay, so my IT is going to be, oh, it's a cat. Okay, uh, and the user comes back and says, oh no, it's actually not a cat. It's a fox. Okay, then I know what is the reward for the action I took. It's for example 0 because I guessed it incorrectly. I also know what would have happened if I said a dog, right? For that also, the reward would be 0. But I know what would have happened if I had said fox instead. I would have gotten a reward of 1. So I would know what would have happened if I said a different answer. Okay, so that's the relation to supervised learning here. So in supervised learning, kind of get full information feedback, whereas in many problems, in realistic problems, you only get bandit feedback. Okay. Yeah, if there are no questions, then what we're going to do is look at basically 3 algorithms. Okay, mostly at intuition. So the objective here is not really understand the nitty-gritty details. Epsilon greedy was kind of easy because it's just saying with some probability just pick a random arm, with some probability just pick the best arm that I know so far. Okay, that's it. That's the algorithm. And it seems to perform well empirically if you as I said, this is kind of essentially the strategy with some context information that's done with the MSN example that we saw earlier. Now we're going to look at 3 algorithms in a similar vein of how they think about how to deal with exploration and exploitation. Okay, so in the epsilon greedy case, there's an exploitation part and there's an exploration part, and both are happening with some probability in every round. Okay, every interaction. And we'll see the same idea of exploration and exploitation happening in the three algorithms. What's going to differentiate the third algorithm from the previous? So each of these algorithms is, one algorithm is going to be kind of deterministic, in the sense of it's not going to use randomness. Sorry, when I said deterministic, it just means that, of course, it's going to be dynamically picking an arm based on what has happened so far in terms of rewards, which arms are picked and how much reward was gotten. But it's not going to rely on randomness, as in, it's not going to flip coins and stuff. Like Epsilon Greedy, for example, it needed to flip a coin with some bias, right? The second algorithm is going to be randomized. Okay, and the third algorithm is going to actually work in what is called an adversarial setting. Okay, by which I mean that we're no more going to assume that there's a mu I of t, or let's say mu1 to mu k distributions associated with each action or each decision. Okay, so we're going to drop these assumptions about distributions associated with the rewards for each of the actions that we take. Okay, so anyway, that's the layout for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's now pick up the first algorithm. It's called the UCB algorithm, upper confidence bound algorithm. Okay, so this strategy is as follows. Okay, it's gonna pick an arm, which is the argmax. Okay, so there are k arms, capital K arms. So I have to pick one of the arms. So it's the argument is the arm that maximizes a number. Okay, so I'm going to maintain one number per arm. Okay, some derived number. So what is that number? That number for every arm. So there are a lot of indices thrown out, over here. So let's say this index is saying which arm it is. Okay, so little kth arm, I'm going to maintain a number, and this number is at time little t. Okay, this number is going to be valid for usage at time little t, and it's going to use information about this arm little k up to time t minus 1. Okay, so I guess that's implied, but it's explicitly stated here. Okay, so that this derived number b is going to be valid for making a decision at time t, and there's going to be one such number for every arm. Okay, so there are k such numbers. You pick the maximum, and that's your arm to play, or that's the decision you make at interaction index t. Okay, little t. Okay, and what is this number? Okay, it's basically saying it's a sum of two terms. One is the first term is the intuitive number, which you should know. So let's say you are at, as I said in the previous running example, let's say we are trying to make the decision at little t is equal to 100, and maybe at this time, okay, I've already did 99 rounds of interaction. Let's say, and I have, let's say capital K is equal to 3 arms. Then let's say I have played arm, let's say I've played arm 1 or shown website version 1 33 times. Okay, then mu hat k is the average of those 33 outcomes, 33 feedbacks that I got from showing website 1. Okay, so that's the average performance. Okay, this is exactly the same number that you would use, for example, in the Epsilon Greedy situation, where that would be the number of performance up to today. Okay, but you're going to add an additional number to that number. So this is the performance up to today. This is data driven, but the additional number is going to somehow induce exploration. So okay, so so let's think of it this way. So if there was no additional number, the one I've circled here, okay, then at every round, all I'm saying is play the best thing that happened, best arm that I think, based on the information so far, always play the best thing that I have, okay, based on the information I have. So for example, let's say out of the 3 arms, arm 1, arm 2, arm 3, maybe I played them 33 times. Sorry, I should make it a table. And out of 33 times, this one gave me 15 clicks, this gave me 10 clicks, this gave me 5 clicks. Okay, then arm 1 is good at this point, so I should play arm 1. Okay, but in the next round, I'll see maybe this did not lead to a click. In the next round, you will see the same thing. 1, 2, and 3. And one was played 34 times. This is played 33 times, 33 times. And this is still 15 clicks. Maybe the click, next time I showed one click or some reward did not realize. This is still 10. This is still 5. I'm still going to choose 1. Okay. So that's essentially what is called a greedy strategy. And the whole point of epsilon greedy was to not just be greedy, but with some probability pick something else, because you would not know, maybe it just happened that the first 33 times you showed that, unluckily you just had less clicks. But number 3, from if you really tried it every time, you get many more clicks, right? So just using this number is not enough. And so the second term, the circle term here, is actually trying to fix that issue of ensuring that just being greedy is not enough. Okay, but instead of doing it in the epsilon greedy way, where you're flipping a coin and picking an arm at random, it's going to add an extra term, which is going to become big if you're not playing the term. Okay, so the term is going to become larger and larger the lesser number of times you have played the term. Okay, so why is that? Because you look at the denominator, it says S, right? So S is the number of times that arm has been played in the up to this point. Okay, up to time little t. Okay, so if S is small, let's say this, let's say the third arm is only played 33 times, but the other arms have played 340 and 330 times, then S is going to be small for the on 3. Okay, so that means this essentially a bonus term. Because the bonus term is inversely related to S, that term is going to be large, and therefore I'll be able to pick 3 and play that. Okay, in this round. Okay? That's the idea of UCB. And again, so that's a strategy. So the idea with all these strategies are somebody spent a lot of effort. Some of the researchers they figured out a strategy like this, and they've empirically seen that it works, and they've also given some theoretical statements about in what conditions would it actually work and what would be its performance in terms of cumulative regret. Okay. So it's not expected that you come up with a new strategy by yourself arbitrarily, but these are some well-known strategies that one should be aware of when you're working with multi-arm bandit type situations. Okay, so here's an example. So the expected regret, theoreticians have proved that it should grow logarithmically as a function of time. Okay, and here is an example. So here you can see that this is not expected. This is a specific instance, specific run, and here you can see that is lower than this upper bound. Okay, so the CK log n is what is the green curve, and there's a function over time or the number of interactions, and this is the cumulative regret. Okay, so you can compute these numbers in simulation, so you can see that a regret, of course, has to not increase linearly. So regret cannot go like this. That means you're not really learning anything. Okay, so it should certainly go as a log function, but it's lower than what is theoretically predicted. In the sense of theoretical predictions, somewhat loose here. Okay, in this instance. Okay, so that's upper confidence bound strategy. Okay, it's called UCB1 actually, because there's other algorithms as well here, the variants which just slightly change in terms of what's the bonus and how arm is picked. Okay, slight changes from the basic idea here. So any questions at this point? Okay, if there are no questions, then let's talk about the second algorithm. So as I said, first algorithm is doesn't really use randomness as a source, unlike epsilon greedy. The third algorithm, which is called Thomson Sampling, is actually from 1933. In a few years, it's going to be 100 years old. But so this algorithm is going to rely on sampling. Okay, so sampling, and therefore there's going to be some distributions involved and so on. Okay, so what is the idea? It's a Bayesian algorithm. The algorithm has again a very straightforward strategy idea, which is the following. Okay, at the beginning of time, you have these arms, right? 1, 2, all the way to k. Let's say 3, and you have mu1, mu2, mu3. So let's say k is equal to 3. Let's say we have these 3 arms or 3 websites, and at the beginning of time, we don't know anything about these, which one is better. So let's assume that these mean rewards themselves are random variables. Okay, so mean reward itself is a random variable whose distribution. So remember, mean rewards. Let's say we have, when you show the website, there's a click or not. Okay, so the Bernoulli outcome, which means that the mean rewards are between 0 and 1. Okay, so for example, mu1 is between 0 and 1. So if this is going to be a random variable, then its support also has to be between 0 and 1. So typically you will assume that mu1 is a random variable with a beta distribution. Okay, beta distribution with some parameters. Let's say 1, 1. Okay, so actually beta 1, 1 is the uniform distribution anyway. So you start with the assumption, because you don't have any data, let's say, at the beginning of time, you say, okay, each of the mean rewards has a uniform distribution on it. Now, what you do is, at any given point of time, you find the posterior over this random variable, let's say mu1, given data. So let's say you somehow picked arms and you got some feedback, and so you're at, let's say, around 100 for some reason at some point in time. So for around 100, what you would have is posterior distributions on each of the arms, because now you have data. Given the data, what's the updated belief of what you think the mean rewards of each of the arms are going to be? Okay. Once you have these posteriors, then the steps are straightforward. Once you have these posteriors, the idea is to sample from the posterior a number. Let's call it theta IT for arm I. Okay, so you get such numbers, let's say 3 numbers for if our running example has 3 arms. Then you just get these 3 numbers and pick the arm which has the highest number. Okay, so there's some randomization happening here because of the sampling, but there is a Bayesian update going on from, okay, you picked an arm, you got some reward in this round. Based on that, you're going to now update your posterior for the next round. Okay, so posterior distribution of which arm you think is the posterior on the mean reward of each of the arms, and therefore from that you can actually figure out which arm you think is the best one as well. So what you're maintaining, the underlying object is the posterior distribution. Okay, so it's a very Bayesian and straightforward idea. You maintain the same belief over all the arms. You try some arms with this, these 2 steps, and every time you try that arm, you update your belief on which arm, update your belief on the mean reward for each of the arms, and that gives you a sense of which arm is the better and better one. And so hopefully you can sample from that arm more and more if its mean is significantly different from the distribution of its mean is different from other arms. Okay, and the way you get to this posterior from, let's say, a prior, let's say the prior is beta, let's say at the beginning of time it's beta 1, 1. The posterior that you need to maintain, you can also keep it as beta something, beta alpha comma beta, as a beta parameter 1, parameter 2, if you can assume that if you have conjugacy. Okay, so conjugacy is an idea that some of you might have seen before. So the idea is that, so we know that posterior is proportional to likelihood times prior, right? And there's a normalization factor, so if you ignore it, then it's likelihood times prior. So conjugacy is the idea that if there is a likelihood function, then if you pick the appropriate prior to that, you get to choose all these distributions, right? Like for example, I chose beta distribution as my belief. If I choose the beta distribution as a belief, for example, as a prior, and I know the likelihood model is Bernoulli, right? A click or not, right? A binary outcome. Then it can be seen that the posterior is also actually the same as prior, in the sense it's also a beta with some other parameter, let's say alpha 1, alpha 2. Okay. So this is called conjugacy. So in this case, what you can do is computing the posterior becomes computationally very easy. Okay. So computing the posterior, you just have to update the parameters alpha 1 and alpha 2 in a simple way, instead of doing an actual posterior computation, which would involve essentially an integration step. Okay, integration step, because there's a denominator which will involve some marginalization. And so this is just base rule, by the way. Okay, so the formal definition of what is meant by conjugacy is given here, but let's actually do something by pictures. So and stick to our Thomson sampling algorithm and beliefs there. So so let's say we have okay. So for Thomson sampling, in our case, let's say k is equal to 3. Okay. Okay. Let's say k is equal to 3. Okay. So a parameter. So I think we've seen the Dirichlet distribution when we're talking about latent Dirichlet allocation in the when we're talking about natural language processing some time ago. So a Dirichlet distribution is a distribution over vectors. Okay, think of k-dimensional vectors for now. For example, when k is equal to 3, such that these vectors also sum to 1. So the individual elements sum to 1, and they're all positive. Okay, so Dirichlet distribution is a distribution over. Actually, let's look at the picture. Dirichlet distribution is a distribution over the simplex. Okay, so this is just think of it this way. So each point over here. So this is 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. Let's say this point, and this point is 0, 0, 1. Okay, so Dirichlet distribution assigns a probability value to every point on this plane segment. Okay, and it can be so. Come back here. What I'm trying to show with this slide is that the okay, that's the definition of the Dirichlet distribution, but I don't want to get into that detail. What I want to show in these slides is that Dirichlet is basically a conjugate prior to the multinomial, or it's also, I guess you can call it categorical. Multinomial and categorical are very similar. Multinomial just means more trials. Dirichlet distribution is a conjugate prior to the multinomial likelihood function, which means that if you multiply Dirichlet with multinomial, you'll get a posterior which is also Dirichlet. Okay, and this, in terms of analogy, is the same as beta distribution being a conjugate prior for the Bernoulli, or I guess binomial likelihood function. With this prior, this likelihood function, you'll get a posterior which is also beta. Okay, it just works out that way, and so that's nice, so that you don't have to do a complex integration to get to a posterior distribution. Okay, in general, computing the posterior using Bayes' rule is messy because of integrations involved. Okay, if you take arbitrary prior distribution, arbitrary likelihood function, you'll get a very messy posterior. Okay, sometimes you would probably have to only access it computationally or through sampling. Okay. But because of conjugate priors, you can actually get it easily. And that's something that you can exploit in the Thomson sampling algorithm. Okay, so that's what is happening in these slides. So I don't want to spend too much time there. Okay, that's what's happening here to show that the posterior is actually also Dirichlet. But let's come back here. Where is it? What I want to show is that in Thomson sampling algorithm, we have a belief. You can think of this as a prior. Okay. Then in a for loop, we are saying given the prior and let's say we have some data. I mean, we can always okay. Let's say we don't have data, then from the belief you sample parameters theta1 all the way to theta k from this belief. Okay, you take the argmax of this to get the arm that you're going to play. This is step 1. Step 2, let's say you play this arm, you got a reward RIT, okay, 2A and 2B. you got this, then what you're going to do is 3, you're going to try to find a posterior belief. Okay, this is going to depend on this prior belief and the data that you have. So this data is what's going to give you likelihood, and this is going to be your prior. Okay, so and the computation of the posterior belief becomes easy if you use conjugacy properties. Okay, so at the end of the day, the idea is that you start playing with a belief that every arm is good, but eventually, because of the feedback that you're getting, your posteriors are going to focus on if you think of the 3 arms, arm 1, 2, and 3, at the beginning you will have a uniform distribution for each one of them. Okay, so you think that the mean mu1, mu2, mu3, they can be anywhere between 0 and 1, 0 and 1, 0 and 1. But eventually, after some rounds, you will see that there's going to be a new distribution. The beta distribution is always between 0 and 1. And I said, if a prior is beta, posterior is also beta. You'll see that all these distributions are between 0 and 1, then they start concentrating. Okay, and you can see that if the resulting beta distribution after 100 rounds of Thomson sampling is like this for all the 3, then you can see that maybe the third one is the one which is the winning alternative or winning treatment. Okay. So any questions about this point up to Thomson sampling? I'm gonna now switch gears and talk about the third algorithm, which is okay. So this slide is saying what's the motivation for the third algorithm. So far for epsilon greedy, UCB, and Thomson sampling, for all 3, at least for the theory of these algorithms, the underlying analysis of the algorithms makes sense. Researchers have to assume that there is an underlying distribution, for example, mu1, mu2, mu3, for each of the 3 arms. Okay, for example, each of the three arms, and so that's assumption is basically makes this setting a stochastic setting. So in that sense, these algorithms are, you can say, work well in the stochastic setting. Now, why should there be a random variable associated with the reward for each arm? There need not be, right? So that's leads to the idea that, for example, the rewards may be the output of a complex deterministic process, or the rewards can be generated by an adversary. Okay, adversary just means somebody who's really trying to mess with you. Okay, in the sense that you're trying to minimize cumulative reward, so you can think of an opponent which is trying to provide you with feedback or with the reward outcomes which are precisely trying to ensure that you're not going to minimize your cumulative reward. Okay, in that for an appropriate level of the adversary, because the adversary cannot be too powerful, so appropriate level of adversary, there's a way to design an algorithm that's going to work well in terms of cumulative regret. Okay, and so it's not going to be expected cumulative regret anymore. If there's going to be an expectation, that expectation is with respect to the internal randomness of the algorithm, but the environment is not random. Okay, so what's the template here? The environment picks a bunch of rewards, all the k rewards, capital K, because k is the number of arms. But you don't see that. Remember, we are working on a bandit feedback. You get to choose an arm based on what happened before, for example, the previous 99 rounds. And then since we are in the bandit settings currently, we only see the reward for the arm that we play. But these rewards are not randomly generated. It could be generated by an adversary. It could be an algorithm. It could be it could be something other than a random distribution. It could also be a distribution as well, but it can be beyond that. Okay. I think I briefly mentioned what full information was, where you would not only see what's the outcome for what you chose, but also what if you have chosen something else. So let's ignore full information for now and talk about an algorithm which can work in this adversarial setting. Okay. Remember, our objective is to minimize some cumulative reward. So the algorithm is essentially, again, the simple idea is to maintain weights on arms or decisions or choices that you have, and increase or decrease the weights based on the rewards that you're getting. Okay, so for example, you played arm one a few times and you got really good rewards, then hopefully you should upweigh the weight on that arm. And then what you can use is once you maintain these weights, you can convert the weights to a probability number. Very similar to the softmax operation you're doing. If I have weights 10, 5, and 15 on 3 arms, then I can renormalize them so that they sum up to 1, and you can do it using softmax operation, for example. And then the way I'm going to pick the next arm is using this probability mass function. Okay, that's the idea. So key idea is maintain weights and pick arm to play using these weights. And of course, these weights have to be updated based on the feedback. That's also there. Okay, so let's start with weights, all weights 1. Okay, all weights equal to 1. And then what we do is for each time little t, we select an arm from a distribution, okay, which is just going to be a normalized version of weights. Instead of softmax, it's just because weights are always positive, so you don't really have to even do e to the power something. So you're just doing weights divided by all of the weights. Okay, so you normalize the weights, you get these ratios, proportions. For example, arm 1 is really good. The numerator is going to be pretty large, but of course, this ratio will never be greater than 1. Okay. So you use the weights, but you take an average. Okay, so this essentially this equation is an average of 1 minus gamma times this weight plus 1 by k. Sorry, plus gamma times 1 by k. Okay, gamma times 1 by k. Okay, so okay, let me focus on the weights part first. You can see that if an arm is doing well, hopefully I can use that doing well feedback to increase the weights of this arm, and therefore the probability of me picking that arm in the future is going to be larger. Okay, so there is a I'm exploiting, but at the same time, for me to explore, I can add an additive term which ensures that no matter how much this weights for of the arms are, there's always going to be with some probability I'm going to pick some other arm. Okay, so because this is a constant number, if gamma is fixed, let's say gamma is 0.9, then this additive term is saying for every arm there's going to be at least an additive term of gamma is 0.1. Then for every arm, there's going to be a 0.1 divided by k. Let's say k is 3. So at least with this probability, every arm is going to get played. Okay, so that's the exploration. I mean, that enables exploration. And so that's pretty much the algorithm. So you play arms with this probability, and then once you get a reward, then what you do is you got a reward, right? So you played arm little k, let's say. You played arm I subscript s. Okay, a subscript s is because you're in let's say time period s. Okay, actually we could have made it t, but it's fine. So so what you do is you got some reward for the arm that you played. You divide it by the probability with which you played that arm. Okay, for the arm that you played, and for every other arm the reward is going to be 0, and then you make an update. Okay, so the update is going to be wt of k is equal to wt minus 1 of k times e to the power x tilde of k. Okay, so where x tilde is computed for every arm. So only because we only get reward for the arm that we played, all the other arms x tilde is anyway 0. But for the arm that we played, we're going to normalize it with the denominator, which is the probability with which we played that arm. Okay, and that's needed for some technical reason. It's basically to ensure that in expectation we have the right reward. Okay, but the update is very simple. So whatever the previous weights, multiply with e to the power the reward that I got now. Normalized reward that I got now. Okay. And if I did not get any reward, it's just e to the power 0, so it's just 1. Okay. So with this weight update, this algorithm actually performs pretty well, even if the rewards for the arms are chosen adversarially. Okay, in the sense that they're chosen not in a stochastic manner, but as long as they're chosen before they see your I mean, so they choose before you pick a specific arm. Okay, as long as you do that, even if they know your algorithm that you're using EXP3, they cannot make you incur a regret greater than some upper bound. Okay, and this upper bound comes from some analysis, but we are not very concerned about that. What we want to see from this graph is a function of number of interactions, which is n or capital T or whatever. And you can see that regret again grows somewhat logarithmically, or actually in this case it's actually growing um, as a function of like square root k. K is the number of arms, as well as square root n, where n is the number of rounds. Okay, n or square root t, whatever. So let's drop t here. Okay, so all this plot is trying to say is that this algorithm also works well. Okay. Again, an auxiliary plot saying that what's the weight on the arm that is supposed to be the best. The weight on the arm that is supposed to be the best kind of increases as a function of more and more you play with the above strategy. Okay, that's what this is being shown here. Okay, so any questions about this part? This was just a quick roundup of a few strategies. So if you're confused about these new strategies, just go back to the epsilon greedy. So as long as you understand epsilon greedy is how it's managing to explore new existing arms so that it doesn't miss trying out an arm which is supposed to be best, and you keep missing it out, and so your regret is going to be large, right? If you keep missing the arm which is supposed to be best because you did not try it. So there's an explore and exploitation trade-off. So epsilon greedy was the first algorithm that we saw, and then UCB and Thomson sampling, and then EXP3 are all variations around the same idea. So with some probability you Thomson sampling and EXP3 is basically with some probability you pick an arm, with some other probability you pick another arm. The probability says that the more promising arms are picked with higher likelihood. And in UCB3, you're just ensuring that the arms that are not played frequently have an additional bonus term, which ensures that they do get picked up eventually. Okay, so the lesser they get picked up, the bigger is the additional term. And so the overall capital B term that you're maintaining per arm, that blows up if a certain arm is not played. Okay. So that's the quick roundup of multi-arm Bandit algorithms. So next, what I'm going to do is start discussing contextual bandits, and if I don't finish it, I'm going to briefly discuss it again in the early part of next lecture. So let's go back to our MSN example. What we discussed so far, there was no context arriving. Okay, in the multi-arm bandit setting, there's no context. Okay? It's just it's like A/B testing. You just have I have A versus B versus C. Which one is the best? Okay, and multi-arm bandits by dynamically changing which website to show as a function of previous data, are able to spend more time on the websites which are already more promising, and so that you don't essentially lose money, so that you're not being wasteful. Okay, that was the point with in comparison to A/B testing. Okay, so now, as I said, if you recall, the goal was to choose content to yield some user behavior like clicks, and the key thing was there was an arriving user context. Okay, so there was no context before. That's okay. So we are going to fix that. But also we're going to assume that there's no carryover effect from one interaction to another. Okay, so this is an assumption we're going to relax next lecture anyway, in the regular reinforcement learning setting. But for now, we'll say that what happens in one interaction has no bearing on how users respond in the subsequent interactions. Okay, so under that setting, we want to find what we want to do is we want to find the best policy, by which I just mean what is the best thing to do. What is the best thing to do under each context? Okay, what's the best thing to do under each context is essentially think of it as a function, right? So it's a function given a context, just says, okay, what is the best thing to do? Maybe show website 1. Okay, maybe in a different context prime, we should show website C. Okay, website A, website C. Okay, so it's basically a function. It's a mapping. Given a context, tell me what's the best thing to do, right? But the key thing is you may not see the same context twice. So for example, the user which had exactly a certain historical usage pattern or certain demographic, you may not see the same user again, right? So yeah, so that's true. And again, to differentiate with multi-arm bandit setting, this setting did not have context, and we were only caring about a single best action. Okay, like very similar to A/B testing. Similar to A/B testing. So okay, so let me see. Do I have enough time? Okay, so I can explain intuition now, and we can talk about an algorithm. And the reason why I introduced EXP3 algorithm is because the algorithm for contextual, an example algorithm for contextual bandit setting builds on the EXP3 idea. Okay, it's called EXP4. So okay, let me explain the intuition. So let's say we have 5 ads. Okay, add 1, add 2, add 3, add 4, and add 5. And we have 4 policies. What are policies? Just think of them as functions, right? A def, function 1. So what are these policies? They give, given context, which ad to show. So okay, there are 5 ads. So this, and we have 4 policies. Think of them as 4 functions. For every context, each function will say, show add 1, or add 2, or add 3, or add 4. Okay, something like that. Now let's look at one round of EXP3. Okay, so now how am I using EXP3? By ensuring that each of the four policies are 4 arms. Okay, so instead of making arms the ads themselves, which are the eventual decisions, I'm going to make arms the policies. Okay, the four policies or functions. Okay, now so what is EXP3 doing? It has 4 policies. It doesn't know which one is good, but it can maintain a weight on these policies and pick one or the other. So pick something based on the weights, right? On the renormalized weights, and there's some probabilistic choice there. So let's say in round T, before we pick the policies, let's say each of the policies is doing the following recommendations. For policy E1 is saying choose add A2. Okay, and policy 2 is saying choose A2 as well. 3 is saying choose 4. 4 is saying choose 4. Okay, so these are the recommendations currently for each of the policies, but we have not picked any one of them yet. So let's say EXP3 chooses an arm. Let's say in our case, sorry, this for some reason, yeah, is chosen arm 1. Okay, so arm as in policy 1. Okay, by sampling from the weights. So because I chose policy 1 or function 1, I'm going to show add 2. Okay, let's say I picked, since I picked the function 1, I showed add 2, and maybe it was, that also happened to be clicked. Okay, because now the ad was clicked, I got a reward, maybe a positive reward. Now I need to update the weights on the arms, right? So let's say, and the reward was normalized. Remember in EXP3, whatever reward I got, divided by the probability with I picked the arm. So given this reward, I'm going to update the weight for, so this is the reward for the arm E1. And for everybody else, it's 0. Okay. This is, the app is misbehaved. Okay, so for every other arm, the reward is 0, and for this arm, the reward is 1. Not 1, but reward is x tilde s. So how, I can do the weight update as I was doing for EXP3, which is that the weight for policy 1 would be updated because I have a new number, and weight for everybody else would pretty much remain the same. Okay. Okay. But we can actually do better. Okay. So the weight update in EXP3 is actually wasteful. Is the punchline here? The idea is that because E1 was also, it was saying add A2, and it was shown, it was clicked, because E2 was also showing the same, was claiming, was suggesting the same ad to be shown. But we know that if we had shown that ad, we would have gotten a reward. We should also update the weights for E2 as well. Okay, that's the core idea. So the idea is, multiple policies could have the same suggestion or the same decision. So if it happens, whatever decision I take, back out whichever policies are suggesting the same decision, and update the rewards, update the weights for all of those policies. Okay. In this case, if E1 did well and therefore it got a good reward, then E2, which also suggested the same action, should also get its weight updated. Okay. That's the core idea in a contextual algorithm, to exploit the fact that multiple policies their weights can be updated if they suggest the same action. Okay, in that way we can exploit the context. And I'm going to revisit this idea again next session. Okay. Yeah. Any questions at this point? Okay, if there are no questions, then that's it for today. We'll continue the last part of an example of contextual bandit problem, and then next class would be the basics of reinforcement learning. Okay. And we'll again revisit the idea of what's the difference between reinforcement learning and supervised learning in the first few slides of the next session. Okay. So thank you for joining. I'll see you guys next week.